How's it going, folks? Rosendo from MLH here. Welcome to day 4 of Global Hack Week, Beginners Week. Hope y'all are having a great time so far this week. We've had a ton of great content that's been, administered by folks from MLH and some of our awesome partners. Today, we've actually got a really great workshop actually from Auth0 yet again. We're going to be learning about role-based access control. If you've never heard of that before, you're going to learn about it today. Once again, as I mentioned yesterday, Auth0 is one of those great APIs that if you're a beginner and you're just learning how to build single page applications or any type of simple applications on the web, using authorization is something that's going to come as sort of natural to that process. So if you want to learn about it, stick around because we've got some really great content coming at you. Without any further ado, we've got Juan from Okta that's actually going to be walking us through a lot of the basics here today. So please give Juan a warm welcome, y'all. All right, let's get it started. Hi, Juan.
Hey, Rosendo. Hey, everyone. I hope everybody is doing great and ready to learn some excellent content about authorization, which is going to be the main thing we are going to be focusing on today. So, we're going to be discussing a little bit about what authorization is, what RBAC is, which is role based access control. We're going to go into details of that, and we're also going to be implementing RBAC or role based access control into an application, into a demo application, so that it's going to be super easy for us to follow and super us to implement for our home projects, or whether you're learning or if you're ready to build production applications either for companies or for things that you want to build for yourself. This is going to be great, as most of the applications out there in the world today are using RBAC. And if they're not using RBAC, they're going to be using something else that I'm also going to share as a last tip at the end of the live stream. So make sure that you stick until the end, and let's get started. Hopefully everybody is ready now to get started. So we're going to start with some slides, but we're also going to be doing some live coding. So yeah, we're going to have a little bit of everything today. All right, let's get started. So what exactly is authorization? Well, authorization is making checks throughout the application to make sure that the user has access to a given functionality. And how do we all start making authorization checks? Well, the first thing all developers do when we don't really know how to implement authorization is something like I added on the screen, right? We simply add a if statement, and then we check for particular things. Like, for example, is the user admin? If the user is admin, then we call this nice function that makes us Batman, right? We may also have other types of authorizations that are not maybe user related. We can also ask, what is the date today? Is the date past a certain uh, specific day? If that's so, we may enable new features, right? So there are multiple ways in which we can do authorization, either by checking the user directly, or by checking properties of the user, or by checking feature flags, for example, that are in our database. But typically, everything starts with an if condition. Now, if conditions are great, but are not really scalable. You can imagine that checking that the user is admin, make me Batman, will only work if you have only one user, and that user has the admin ID. Now we can expand this to add and include and maybe have an array of users that are admins, but that quickly becomes very problematic because it's not really a scalable solution. So there is a natural flow from this simple if statement that we have here into a more robust solution, which involves using roles. So now you can imagine that we have a user database somewhere, and then we will assign roles to each one of the users. So instead of checking if the user is an admin, now we can check if the user role is admin, then we can make the user Batman. And for example, if the user role is an editor, then we can make the user Bruce or anything like this, right? And this is already a much better solution because now we disassociate the specific user condition into something that can be configurable in the database or whatever it is that you are storing your user objects. So this is already a lot better. And this is the first step that we are going to take today in order to secure an application. So yeah, because I love coding and I think explanations work better when we see them in code and demos. We're gonna jump straight into our demo application where we're gonna fix an admin page so that only users who are admins can access it. Let's jump first into the application. So hopefully everybody can now see this beautiful application that I built that contains a few pages. So we have a home, which is publicly available for everybody to see. And we have a protected area and we have an admin area. We also have an option to log in, and we're going to discuss that in a minute. But now, if I click on the admin page, we can see that the admin page right now is publicly available. I'm not logged in as a user, and yet I can see this highly sophisticated admin page that I built, right? And now this shouldn't be the case. I should only be able to access this admin page if I'm logged in as a user in the application, and also I have admin rights to see this screen, right? So there are two things that are failing here. We can access this page without being logged in, first, and second, we can access this page without being an admin or a member of the admin roles. And then we have a protected page. And this protected page will only require us to authenticate no matter which role we have. And this is something it's already implemented. And we implemented this using Auth0. Now, if you don't know what Auth0 is, Auth0 provides you authentication as a service. So it's a service that you can sign up for free. We're going to have the link down there in the banners. And basically, you can create a free account, and that free account will give you authentication capabilities to your application. So you will have the options to log in your users through username and password, also through passwordless flows like passkeys, using organizations, and a lot more features, including authorization, which is gonna what we are gonna be discussing today. So I already went ahead and configured this application to use Auth0. If you don't know how to use Auth0 configured for Next.js application, by the way, this is built in Next.js. You can also check the link that we're going to be sharing now on the screen. So that particular link will give you access to what we call the quick start guide, which is a step-by-step instructions on how to secure an application with Auth0. But now, while we do that, let's see what happens when we click on the protected endpoint right here. So when I click now on the protected endpoint, I'm automatically being redirected to the Auth0 page. Now, if we take a look here, we are not anymore on localhost. We are on another domain, which belongs to the Auth0 domain. Now, this is something that is customizable. You can have your own custom domains in here. But what is important for us to understand is that we made a redirection. We jumped from our application into the Auth0 service. And this is what the login box from Auth0 looks like. You may be familiar with it from other applications that you used, namely, for example, ChatGPT. If you use ChatGPT, the way you log in is also through Auth0. And in this case, I have the default settings. That means that I can log in with a username and password. I can enable the forgot password flow. I can sign up for an account, or I can log in with, for example, a service provider like Google, which is what I'm going to do now, uh, just for testing purposes. So I'm going to click continue with Google, and I'm redirected back to my application. We are once again in localhost 3000, and now we can see the protected endpoint. Right? So we got redirected back to the protected endpoint, and only users who are logged in can view this page. So if I go back to my home, I still see the logged in state here in the top right. And if I go back into protected, I can see that page without being redirected back to Auth0. So let's quickly take a look into how this work from a code perspective, and then we are going to start working on the admin page. Because right now, the admin page, even though I'm logged in, it should also be checking for the admin role, which is currently not doing. By the way, as we go through the code, if you have any questions, please drop them in chat. I'll try to take a look and answer all the questions that you may have as we move forward. So let's jump into the code editor now. And all right, so what I have here is a simple Next.js application using the latest app router and the latest iteration of Next.js, which I believe right now is Next.js 15. And we basically did two things. I installed the Next.js SDK. So if we take a look into our package.json, we'll see here that we have the Auth0 Next.js SDK that allows us to connect to Auth0 and add authentication very easily into our application. And that's the only really dependency that we need right now. And then if we take a look into our environment variables, we configure a few a few environment variables that are required for the Auth0 SDK to work. And you can retrieve all these values from your Auth0 dashboard. So now we're gonna go into the Auth0 dashboard. And when you arrive for the first time to your Auth0 dashboard, you'll see this getting started page. And you can try the login box, which is exactly what we saw before. You can add social providers, etc. But the part that we are interested in is into these applications. Under applications, I already created an application following the quick starter guide we shared before. And if I click into that application, now I have access to all the settings, like the domain we have here is also set up here as Auth0 base URL. And then we have a client ID, a client secret, which are all values that we retrieve from that. Again, if you follow the quick start guides, you will have all these all the steps on how to retrieve each one of these values and how to set them up in your environment variables. The next thing we did to implement the SDK is we define an API route. And this API route is a dynamic API for all things Auth0. And we only define one file, which is this route.ts. And if we take a look, we simply tell Auth0 to handle all the routes that fall under this dynamic routing. So under the authentication folder or the authentication path, meaning that this will automatically implement the login for us. It will automatically implement the logout for us and the callback that we need. So these are all the steps that we need to get authentication up and running. Again, you can follow the quick start guide that we share before on the screen and also here on chat to see how authentication is implemented. Another important thing that we did is in the protected route. I'm going to now enter the protected page. I simply wrap my component with this method with page auth required, which we are importing from the Auth0 SDK. And what this is going to do, if the user is not authenticated, it will force a redirect into the login page. And if the user is already authenticated, it will default to our page component, how you will normally access it if this will not be around. So this is just a wrapper for all of our pages in case we want to have authentication to that particular page. There are other ways that you can do that, and I recommend that you check out the Next.js SDK documentation to see other ways that include, for example, the middleware or including doing manual authorization checks in your page code itself. So pick up what is the best for your use case. In our case, that we want to protect only individual pages, I opt out for using this method, contrary to the middleware, but the middleware option is also a great option when you want to do more of these pages under the authentication. All right, so we talk enough about authentication. Let's start thinking about authorization. So how does Auth0 can help us with authorization into our application? Well, the first thing that we need to know is that Auth0 provides information about the user after the user is logged in. So if I go into the code for the protected page, we see that I'm displaying here a card which simply says protected. Only login users can view this page. And this is basically what we have here. So this card shows this information. But if we scroll down, there's a little bit more. So let's see exactly what that looks like. And we have this div that is printing information about the session. And the session is coming from the Auth0 SDK. And from the session, we can retrieve values such as a user or an access token. So let's take a look a little bit on what a user is, what an access token is. Let's first take a look into the user. So if we take a look into the page, we see that the first object we print on the screen is the user. And as you may have guessed, it's simply a collection of properties that are related to the user that is logged in. Like, for example, what is the given name, the family name in this case, the nickname, there's a full name, there's a picture that is related to this user, when the user was last updated, the email of the user, if the email is verified. There's a particular ID for this user, and there's also an internal ID for this user. Now, all this information, because I use the login with Google provider, is coming from the information or the data that I had in my Google profile. So the picture that we see here assigned will be the same photo that I have in my Google profile. If I would have opted to sign up with Auth0 and create a new account using a username and password, now this picture will have to be manually uploaded, or by default, it will use a service like Gravatar. Um, but yeah, so this is information that we have about the user. It's pretty easy to use. It is an object, and we can access all the properties directly in our application. And then we have something called an access token. And the access token now looks a little bit strange, as it's a giant string of letters and numbers. So it's not really something like the user, that we can simply read on the screen and understand exactly what it is and all the parameters. Uh, However, it's not a completely strange format. It is actually a base64 encoded JSON token that we can decode to access its values. So now we can access a website to, like, for example, jwt.io. We can add that as well on the banners. But jwt.io will allow us to decode these access tokens to see what they contain inside. So I'm going to paste that now into this application, and we're getting an error about invalid signature. We will not focus on that for now. But if we paste that value, now we can see how it looks like decoded. And we can see this is simply a JSON structure, and it contains three properties: an algorithm, how it's encoded, and an issuer. And the issuer is the Auth0 organization. Now, there is no information on this access token about the user, and there's no information on this access token about the role. But that's something we are going to change next. I'm going to quickly check some questions that we have from chat. So we have here Moises that is asking what authorization means. Well, authorization is the process of adding checks in your application to determine the access to functionality. Like, for example, we discussed if a user is an admin, he can access the admin page. Or if a user, for example, think of a blog. If you have a blog, you may have people who are admins that can edit and delete all the blog posts. Then you may have, for example, someone who's an editor that may only edit but not delete. And then you will have people that are, for example, viewers that can only have access to read information on the blog, right? So authorization is simply putting all these checks throughout your application to make sure that the access to certain resources are restricted to the adequate people. Hopefully that clarifies that, Moises, and thanks for your question. All right, so continuing, so we know there's an access token, and we know there's information about the user here, but there's no data about a role. It's not part of the user, and it's not part of the access token. And this is because we haven't told Auth0 that we really want to process user and roles for this particular application. So that's what we are going to do next. So we're going to head back to the Auth0 dashboard here. And in the Auth0 dashboard, I'm going to switch from applications into user management. And when I'm on user management, I click on users. And we see, for example, here is my user. Now, if I click on my user, this is the user I just used to log in. We can see there are two tabs here, one for permissions and one for roles. As of now, we are interested in this roles tab. So I'm going to click on that. And we can see effectively there are no roles assigned to this user yet. So we can go ahead and assign users, assign roles to this user. And we can see there are no roles available. So that may be a problem, but don't worry, they're very easy to add. We're going to head back into the roles under user management. Instead of clicking on users, we're going to click on roles. And once we are on roles, now we can create a new role. And I'm going to call this role admin. Now, the name that we give here is completely arbitrary. So don't worry about that. We're going to just call it admin. And as for the description, we're going to say users in this group are admins in the app and can access all pages. This is simply a description. It's in case we have many roles, is for us to understand exactly what this role is about. So I'm going to now click on create. And now on the roles page, I'm going to click in users. And I'm going to add the user to this role. So I'm going to look for the user that we have, and I'm going to assign it. And now this role contains one user. And we can do this now that the role is created. We can do it from both ways. I can go into the role and add users, or I can go into the user and see the roles, right? And we'll see that the user now contains a role called admin. And this is great, right? So we can now go into our application and maybe we can see information about the role. So let's click on logout. And let's log in again, just to make sure all information is refreshed. And now when we click on continue with Google, we are going to be logged in, again in the protected endpoint or in the protected page. And we take a look into the user, and there are no roles associated with it. And if we take a look into the access token, by copying all that long, weird string, we are going to jump into JSON Web Tokens again, jwt.io. I'm going to paste it. And again, there's no information about the role. And the reason why is because so far we created a user. We created a role and we associated the role with the user. But we never told Auth0 that this particular application needs access to that information. And there are multiple ways we can do that. This is why Auth0 doesn't default into any of the solutions. So we are going to discuss two solutions today. The first one, we are going to push the role into the user object. So into the user that we see here on this page, the one that is nicely formatted for us. We can add the role here, and then we can access that role in the code. And that's the first thing that we're going to do. Now, this user is coming from something called the ID token, which, contrary to the access token, is information that is supposed to make, or is information that is available to the client so that the client can make decisions. So you are safe if you access the ID token server side in your Next.js application, or if you access the ID token on the client side. So it doesn't matter if we are on the server or if we are on the client. In a Next.js application, you can use the ID token, you can use the user information safely on both of these places. Now, the access token is a little bit more important and contains more crucial information, and it's designed to be accessed only by APIs on the server side. So the access token should never be exposed into the client side of the application. So this is why the roles for now, we're going to add them to the ID token so that they are available for both the client and the server. But it's important to note that when we are developing features and we want to validate that those features are indeed accessible for the users, we can do client validations with the ID token and server validations with the access token. Let's start with the ID token. So I'm going to go into a new functionality we haven't seen yet, which is called actions. actions are JavaScript functions that you can call throughout processes that involve Auth0. Let me open the page and we can simply explain for it. So actions contains or have something called triggers, and triggers are the different steps in the process where you can inject your own JavaScript code. Like for example, we can call a JavaScript function before the user registers into the application. We can call a JavaScript function after the user registers into our application, or we can call a JavaScript function after the user logs in the application. And this is exactly what we want to do, because what we want is after the user is logged into the application, we want to modify the user object so that we make sure those roles are attached into that user. By the way, there are other triggers that you can access for Auth0 to customize different parts of the flow. But for now, we're going to be focusing on this post login flow. So I'm going to click on that. So each flow looks something like this. There's a start of the flow, there's a complete, and then we can add the different functions that we create to, to this flow. Right now, I don't have any action installed and I don't have any custom action. So I'm going to create a new one. And there are functions that are already defined by Auth0 and by third parties through the Auth0 marketplace. These are uh, functions that allow you to integrate with third-party services, like for example, Stripe or many others. There are like over 100 different integrations that you can take a look into. There are templates, or we can build from scratch. And this is the solution we're going to take now. So we're going to build a new action from scratch, and we are going to call this. This is not like a variable name or anything like that. We can call it however we like. So we can say something like add roles to the user object. Well, I cannot type anymore. There we go. Add roles to the user object. And we're going to trigger this as a login, post login flow. And we're going to use node 18, which is the recommended here. I'm going to click on create. And this will send us to the Auth0 actions editor, which is kind of like Visual Studio for your actions. So you have intelligence, you have linting to check if you are making any mistakes or if there are any errors with your code. You can also install dependencies. So any npm package that you may need in your function, you can add it here and then use it in your function. You can also have secrets, which are great way to set up variables. And you can, of course, test and simulate any transaction that you want. So I'm going to simply now test this function by clicking run. It's not exactly doing anything, but I want to show how this looks like. So I'm going to click now on run. And by the test result, it's telling me it didn't execute any custom commands. It didn't give any error. And then it provides some stats about the function execution. Nothing that is super interesting for us here. So I'm going to close that. And we're going to start writing some code. So one of the things that I really like to do is, if you take a look to this left side where it says test, here is already passing some objects that are available to the function, which are two, event and API. Now, I can do things like event, dot, and explore the different objects. I can also look into the documentation about what the event is for any of the given actions. But I also really like to go into event, into this test area and see this JSON and see what things are inside. So I know there is a transaction. I know there is something about authentication, but there is also something about authorization. And there's these roles, which is very interesting to us, right? Because these are the roles that the user has. So this is something we are going to use, right? And then there are other things like connection and organization that we are not really interested right now. So we need access to these roles. So we need somehow to do event.authorization. See, as I'm typing, intelligence is already suggesting things. And then I have roles. Okay, and now I see that there's an issue here, and I can over the issue, and it tells me kind of like what the issue is, which in this case, authorization can be undefined, and we have some quick fixes. But in my case, I'm simply gonna put like a question mark, and now this is the variable that contains our roles. So I can say I can create that into a const called roles, and I'm gonna assign this value. Now I don't want this to be undefined because I'm using the question mark here. So I'm gonna default that into an empty array. So in case there are no roles or the authorization object is null, which shouldn't be the case in our scenario, but in case that will happen, it can happen under other scenarios. We will assume that there are no roles, and that's perfect. So now we know what the user roles are, and now we need to modify the user object so that we set these roles. And for that, we're gonna use the API object that is passed into this function. So I'm gonna do API, and then I'm gonna do ID token. The ID token relates to the user object, and this is what we want to modify. So I'm gonna do ID token, and then I'm gonna do set custom claim. This allows me to set basically a new um, property into the user object. So we're gonna call this property roles, or we can give it also a namespace like mlh/roles, and then we are gonna simply say roles here, and now I'm gonna save this draft. So see, here we are saying, okay, so the ID token, we are gonna add a custom property, or to the user, we are adding a custom property. The property name is gonna be this, and these are the values that we are gonna pass, which are coming from roles. So I'm gonna go ahead and test this again, and I'm gonna click on run. And we see here that now the test results for the function executed some commands, and the command that is executed is setting a custom claim on these roles and this ID token. So it seems to be working. Let's deploy this function. Deploy means getting the function ready to work, and by this particular version. So now that's deployed, we can go back into triggers, post login, and in here, now we can add the roles into the user object. So I can now I have the action here on the screen. I can drag and drop and put that in the middle of the flow. I can apply, and now every time a user logs in, it's gonna call this function. It's gonna add the roles to the user object, and then it's gonna continue with the authentication flow. So let's see how that looks like now in our profile page. Let's log out because we enable those functions in the login function. So we need to log in again. And I'm going to click continue with Google like we did before. And now we can see that the user object got modified. And now we have a role here. And now this is something we can use to work in our application. So we know there's a new property called MLH roles, and that contain or may contain an admin property. So let's jump back into our code, and let's take a look how we can secure our admin page. So now I'm going to jump into the admin page. The admin page is simply a component or a page that returns this card, and it's not doing any checks or validations whatsoever. So we're going to start by fixing that. We're going to export default, and then we're going to say with page auth required. So we want to make sure that a user is logged in into the application in order to access the admin page. And we are going to use it to wrap the admin page function we created. And there we go. And then we have a second parameter, which is where we want to return to after logging in. There we go. And we're going to make this function async. Yeah. And so now it matches with the function signature that requires with page auth required. So now, whenever we try to access this page, we need to be logged in in order to access the page. But we are not checking the role yet. So we're going to do that next. So once the user is logged in and it can access the admin page, we need to retrieve information about the user. So we're going to create a new const called session. We are going to ignore what uh, Copilot here is saying, although this is technically correct. We're going to call get session from the Auth0 Next.js SDK. There we go. And now inside session, we can access a user. And that user, we know, is going to contain our MLH roles property. So we can do this. And remember, the session could be undefined, though, because we know the user is always going to be logged in at this point. We know the user is always going to be there. So we can replace that for the bank there, assuring that the session is going to be always present. And then we can do something like includes admin, although admin is with capital A in our case. And then we do our if statement, and we check if the user is admin. Actually, we can say if the user doesn't contain admin, and then we can return, instead of returning the card, we're going to return a redirect to our unauthorized endpoint. There we go. Oh, I did the wrong import. So there we go. We're going to import redirect. There we go. So now we do a Next.js redirect to the unauthorized endpoint if the user roles do not include admin. So let's see how that looks like. I'm going to click again into the admin page here, and we can see it. But this is because the user also has the admin role. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to log out. And I'm going to go back into users. I'm going to go back into my username here. And I'm going to click on roles. And I'm going to detach this role from the user. There we go. I'm not an admin anymore. So I can go back into the application. And I'm going to try to go into admin. I need to log in once again. And now that I log in, I get, when I click on admin, I get redirected to the unauthorized endpoint because I don't have access to that page. Though I'm currently logged in, I can see that in the protected endpoint, I don't have any roles, and thus I don't have access to the admin page. And that's basically how we do an authorization check using roles with Auth0. Now we can take this a step further. If we take a look into our presentation, of course, then the natural thing that happens is what happens when we have multiple roles, and multiple roles will need to have access to the same page. Then things can get convoluted in the sense that you will may have in the admin page asking if the user has the admin role or the editor role or that other role. It can get very confusing. It's also very confusing to maintain exactly what are the permissions each role has, right? Because right now we define an admin, and that admin can do everything. But if you start having multiple roles, like an accountant, like a developer, what exactly does it mean to be a developer? What are all the resources that page can access? That is very hard to do in the setup that we did by checking only roles. So that's where RBAC comes, role-based access control. And in this case, the decisions are done based on permissions assigned to a user via roles. So we don't check directly for the user roles, we check directly for the user permissions. And you can think of it this way, for example. You can have, let's say you have the example again of a blog post, and you can have things like roles can be like guests, which are people who's not logged in. It can be an admin, it can be an editor, it can be a paying customer, it can be an enterprise customer, so things of that nature. And the permissions can be, can it view a blog post? Can it edit blog posts? Can it delete blog posts? Right? And then each one of these roles will have different permissions associated with. with it. Like for example, guests may only view, admins may view, edit, and delete. Editors may only view and edit, and etc. 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 So this makes this simplifies the understanding of what exactly looks like and what kind of permissions a role will have by using this set of permissions instead. And well, here's an example: an editor can edit all blog posts that we talk about. And now, when we are using something like RBAC, our if conditions will be a little bit different. And the only difference is instead of using roles, we are using an array of permissions. That's basically it. And the good thing is Auth0 provides us a way to do permissions very easily. So now if we go back to our Auth0 dashboard, in order to do permissions, we need to create an API. I know we are not exactly using an API for our example, but Next.js in a way behaves kind of like a client API by separating client and what runs on the server. So we're going to create an API for everything that Next.js will run on the server side. And so I'm going to call this the MLH API, and then it's going to have an identifier. This is simply something for us uh, to identify this API too. We don't really, it doesn't really matter what we put, but normally we do something that looks like an URL, and we're going to leave all the defaults. We're going to click that on create, and when we create an API, now we can define permissions for that API. And so, for example, we can say that a permission is can fly. So someone with this permission can fly, right? And we can add a description, can fly, for example, right? So we can add multiple things. We can say read admin, reads the admin page, right? So you kind of like you get the point. So we add a list of permissions. And now when we go into roles, if we take a look into our admin role that we created before, we can define permissions for this role. And so now I can add permissions and I can say, okay, so this role has access to this API and it can access the read and the fly permission, for example. Oops, I just clicked wrong there. But if we take a look into, oh, I went out. If we go back to roles and we go to admin and we go to permissions, and now we see the list of permissions that are available uh, uh, for that role. And so now we need to make the changes in the UI. And the first thing we need to do is we need to tell Auth0, now you are not only logging in into this application, but you are also logging in into this API. And to do that, we're going to change our environment variable and we're going to add another variable here, which is the API identifier. I never remember exactly what the name of the API identifier is. So it's always great to look into the documentation. Particularly, you can take a look into the Next.js SDK examples. We're going to post the links here on the screen or on the chat. And now in here, we can look into audience. And here is, we can pass the audience by hand, or we can use the Auth0 audience environment variable that we have. So let's quickly do that. We're going to add the audience, and the audience is our identifier in the API that we created. Let's take a look again into application APIs, and here it is. This is our audience. We're going to copy that, and we're going to paste it into our environment variables. There we go. Oops. Pasted that wrong. There we go. All right. So you can only see the starts, but I'm actually pasting the value in there. It's just that I have some other stuff you're not supposed to share. All right. So now when we log in into the application, we are not only logging in as a user, but we are logging in as a user of this API. So the other thing that I want to do is I want to make me an admin again so that we can see how that works. I'm going to go into roles, and I'm gonna reassign me the admin role. There we go. So now when I log in, I will have access to this API. One last thing we want to change is if we go back to our API and we scroll down into the settings, we want to make sure that we have these airbag settings and that we enable airbag. That way, this API will work with airbag. And we also want to toggle this that says add permissions in the access token. And now we're going to go and click on save. And this is ready. So our API is using airbag, our application and our user are configured to use this API. So now if we log out and we log in back again, and we're gonna again log in with my same user using Google, I get this new pop-up. This pop-up now appears because now I'm logging in not only into the application, but I need access to the API. So this is a default window that appears every time you connect an application with a service like Google, Facebook. You'll see a similar settings. You can configure this to disappear, so users don't need to go through this process. But in our case, in development mode, we have that, so we know everything that is happening. All right, so we just log in back into the application. Let me make this bigger again, and I'm gonna go again into the protected endpoint, and we still see the roles, but we don't see anything about permissions. But if we take a look into the settings, the permissions are added to the access token, not to the user object. So now we take this access token that we have here, we go all the way to the end, we copy that, and we go to jwt.io again, great resource for everything authentication and authorization related. We paste that, and now we have more data. Now we have this header, but we also have this payload. And now in this payload, we can see this audience field that tells us we have access to this API, but we also have the permissions. So now we know what the permissions for this particular application are, and we can use these permissions in order to do our checks. So let's quickly go back now into the application code. There we go. And let's quickly go back into our admin page. And our admin page is great. It's checking if the role is admin, but we know, this can get messy. So we don't really want to do this. What we want to check is we want to check for the access token. Now, the access token is available in the session access token. So the same way we can access the user object. But we know this is just a string and not particularly a nice string to have, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to decode this. And for that, there's a function called JWT decode. And we are going to import this. This is coming from a package called JWT decode. And we're going to pass the access token here. In case there is no access token available, we're going to simply use an empty string. There we go. All right. And now this value will contain the permissions as we need it, right? Like if now I do console the log of that access token that is decoded, we should be able to see the access token in our next JS logs. So now I'm going to refresh the page once again, and I'm going to go see my logs. Here we are. And where are my logs? Console log. Did I save? Okay, now it's saved. Oh, we go back to the admin page. We were not having the logs because, yeah, we were not visiting the right page. But now that we are visiting the admin page. We can see that we are printing exactly the same thing we saw in jwt.io. We have all these things plus the permissions. So now we could very quickly, go back into the application, and we can change our if condition here. And we can say now, instead of checking for the role, we can check for, let's store this in a variable, const access token. Let's name this correctly, access token. There we go. And now we can do access token dot permissions dot includes, and we can say if it includes, I think we call this can fly as one of the example permissions. So if the user can fly, we redirect back to the authorized page. So let's take a look into that. And I go back to the admin page, and I'm getting unauthorized. Okay, so permissions that not exist in JWT payload. This is because we are using TypeScript, and JWT code doesn't know about this permissions property. So we just need to define a new interface. This is something you only need to do when you are with TypeScript. JWT access token, and we are gonna basically say that it extends JWT payload, and it adds a permissions, which is a string of, which is an array of strings. And now when we call JWT the code, we can say that this is of type JWT access token. And now that fixes our issue with TypeScript. So now the access token has the permissions array, and if it doesn't include that, we redirect to the unauthorized page. Once again, I click now on admin, and I can see the admin page. And that's kind of like everything we wanted to discuss today for authorization. I know we went a little bit fast at the end because I was kind of like checking on time, and I wanted to make sure we had some time for questions at the end. But today we learn how to configure roles in Auth0. First, we discussed how to implement authentication with Auth0 very briefly. Then we discussed how to use roles in Auth0, how to assign users to roles and roles to users. We also discussed how to add those roles into the user object so that we can access that through the Next.js application. And then we introduced permissions with RBAC. We created an API. We gave the API a set of permissions, and then we validated those permissions in our application. And yeah, now we have it working, folks. And this kind of authorization, RBAC, is what is used in most of the commercial applications that are out there. Roles is one of the most basic and widely used permissions methods that are out there. There are some more advanced use cases. We don't have the time to go into that into this workshop, but if you are really interested in knowing the future of authentication, there's something called OpenFGA. And FGA um, it's fine. It's relationship based access control, which is really powerful. It's a lot more powerful than using roles, but of course requires additional services and other type of implementations. It is an open source project. It is great, so make sure that you check this out. But yeah, now you know how to use roles and permissions, and with that, you can go ahead and start building amazing, safe, and secure applications. Thanks for everything, and yes, now we are open for some questions. Just chat, trying to catch up a little bit with chat, see if you have any questions. Yeah, so we have some people that are very happy with how easy it has been with Auth0. Yeah, I mean, in less than an hour, we managed to do authentication, authorization, and all these checks, even though in a simple application, the principles are the same. You just have more if statements throughout your application, the more complex it is. But yeah, with Auth0, made that really easy for us. We don't have a database. We didn't set up databases, JSON files. We don't have hard coded values. Like, I mean, it's um, the application we have. Those simple is really production grade and very safe. Uh, so yeah, thanks for that. All right, just catching up a little bit with chat. We have a lot of people in here today, so that's great to see people from different countries. Always great. Yeah, I think. Well, if there are no any other questions, I think we can kind of like close it out from here.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Juan. Really appreciate the time that you took to put together this presentation and to walk us through some of the intricacies behind RBAC. Definitely something that I was very curious about coming into the workshop. For everyone that stuck around and chose to take this journey with us, congratulations to you too. If you have any other questions, please feel free to head over to our Discord channel and head over to the Ask Auth0. Ask Auth0 channel. We'll have a copy of the slides there for you as well if you're curious about that. Additionally, if you want to check out any of the challenges, make sure you go to our challenges page at ghw.mlh.io/challenges, and you'll see some of the awesome Auth0 challenges that we have waiting for you this week as well. There's only a couple more days left in Global Hack Week, so make sure you get those done prior to the end. Outside of that, yeah, thanks so much, everybody, and thanks, Juan, for joining us. Really appreciate your time here. Hope y'all had a great one. And yeah, we'll see you again later. In the next 4 minutes, we'll have another workshop coming up right after this. So keep it locked and hopefully you'll enjoy that one as well. All right.
Right? Thanks, everybody. Thanks for having me.